if you wanted to make enough rose oil for every woman in China to have Chanel No. 5, you literally have to cover the entire planet in roses. And yet, this incredible enzyme and metabolic and process engineering approach was able to ferment just a single acre of corn into a highly efficient manufacturing process for some of these ingredients.
Alrighty, hello everyone and welcome to the Deal Maker Show. So today we have an amazing founder, a founder that has done it multiple times, and I think that we're going to be learning quite a bit about building, scaling, financing, and you name it. I think that the conversation is going to be quite inspiring. We're going to be talking about some of the ways that he thinks about, let's say, alternative financing, customer-centric business models, the history too of biotechnology, as well as how he has been able to deal with being impatient, too, through the journey of building and doing stuff on his end. But again, be prepared for a really exciting conversation today. And without further ado, let's welcome our guest today, Christopher Pirie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So originally born in Northern California. So give us a walk through memory lane. How was life growing up for you?
Oh, gosh. Quite idyllic, I would say. 5 acres of Sonoma rolling hills is not a bad place to wake up every morning when you're a little kid. Just walk out the door, run around in the woods. But it was an amazing place to spend my early years. But also, when I was a little bit older, we moved up to Seattle, and Seattle is just equally a pleasant place to grow up as a young person, and also to have the educational foundations of this place. It's amazing.
So how did you get into problem solving and, all of that good stuff that eventually would get you into MIT?
Oh, man. As an undergraduate, I feel like so many folks navigating the college experience, I went to an undergraduate counselor and sort of said, hey, I'm good at math. I'm good at science. What should I do with my career? And they said, well, if you want to live in California, you should major in chemical engineering. And if you want to live in Seattle, you should major in biological engineering. And I just loved this city so much there at University of Washington. So I joined the biological engineering department. And, there, the undergraduate class is maybe 50% pre-med and the other 50% pre-PhD. And I found myself gravitating towards research. And at the same time, I had this tremendous fear of becoming a doctor and having patients that I would see not listen to my advice and keep getting sicker and sicker. So I was quite scared of clinical practice. And so ended up, as I say, gravitating towards the research side of things. And when it was time to pick a graduate school, of course, MIT is hard to say no to.
I hear you. So now, how did you start getting into the whole business side of things? Because obviously via the business school and the access and the exposure that they gave you, it sounds like the venture world came knocking to you.
Yeah, this is, I don't know if it's necessarily a unique offering of MIT, but, when you're so close to the business school, and I think every graduate, or most graduate students, I should say, have this experience along the course of their PhD journey of kind of realizing that they're not going to be in the academic regime for their entire career, and they start thinking about things other than basic scientific research. And for me, that led to spending time and taking classes over at the Sloan Business School and building some incredible relationships with MBA students who were there at the time, and who I continue to work with to this day. But spending time on both sides of campus, sometimes in the research lab, sometimes in the classroom, it gave me this cross-sectional exposure. And I had some of that exposure when I was younger. My dad had started a couple of companies in the telecom industry, and I had been around early stage venture and the energy of that place. And I always enjoyed operating at this sort of interface between the cutting edge science and the entrepreneurial journey. And it just so happened that towards the end of my thesis work, ended up connecting with a couple of other like-minded individuals and starting my first company.
Well, let's talk about that. How do you get going with the first company?
Well, in fact, it was in one of those classes where oftentimes they'll have researchers from across campus come in and present their research, and because they have the notion that perhaps there's commercial opportunity there. And as a student in those classes, you typically hear all the presentations, and then you get to list off which you'd like to work on that semester. Well, sure enough, I listed off one of these technologies as my second choice. And I didn't get my first choice, but I got my second choice. That second choice technology became the foundations of Manus Bio. And it was just through that semester of working with the inventor, who happened to be a postdoc in the chemical engineering department. We worked together for that semester. And then in the weeks after the class was over, I sort of finished my work and I move on. I thinking I'm going to just go back to my thesis research. And he shoots me an email a couple of weeks later. He says, "Hey, I think we should get together for a coffee." He sits me down with myself and a Sloan fellow who he'd worked with in another class. And he said, "Look, I think the three of us should go start a business together." And that became Manus Bio. And so the three of us, we kind of spent the first 6 months, 12 months or something like that, just hanging out around campus, figuring out what we were going to build together and going through the early product market fit machinations for what was a very academic technology at the outset, but would ultimately become the commercial success that is Manus Bio.
As you are looking back now, what do you think were some of the toughest things as a first-time entrepreneur back then?
As an early career scientist, especially in academia, so much of your work is about demonstrating how much knowledge you have. Passing tests, publishing scientific papers, presenting it at conferences, proving to your peers and to the rest of the world how much you know. And I think for me, it was fairly quickly after leaving academia and starting the company, I realized how little that really mattered, because at once you're a part of a broader cross-functional team that's trying to accomplish these grand challenges. And at the same time, your ability to communicate with people outside of your scientific regime or without any scientific training whatsoever, and your ability to manage other people, which is less about how much you know and more about how you interact with other humans, become much, much stronger driving forces for your success as an entrepreneur and as a company builder. And I certainly had my growing pains and have had over the last decade plus of building companies, but those were some of my earliest learnings as a first-time founder. And I was fortunate enough to have two co-founders who had some practice in both of these areas to support me through that growth.
So what ended up being Manus Bio?
Well, Manus Bio, its foundations were really in a metabolic engineering technology, modifying microbes to eat sugar and produce flavors and fragrances. Many of which are natural products that would otherwise be sourced from plants and farming. And what we created was the potential for using fermentation, the classical process that society has used to make beer and wine and other things for millennia, to produce some of these natural ingredients at scale in a much, much more efficient manner. So we always had these analogies about different plant ingredients like rose oil or something like that, where if you wanted to make enough rose oil for every woman in China to have Chanel number 5, you literally have to cover the entire planet in roses. And yet this incredible enzyme and metabolic and process engineering approach was able to ferment just, say, a single acre of corn into a highly efficient manufacturing process for some of these ingredients. So they've been fortunate enough to go on to expand manufacturing capacity and go to scale and market with some of these early products, even after I left after just a few years.
And the company just announced a merger, raised over 100 million. So, I mean, the company has done pretty well. I guess, at what point do you realize it's time to turn page and move to Seattle?
Oh, it's such a hard thing for a founder to recognize the need for their own transition, whether that's because, the company has grown in a way that outgrows them, or they've outgrown, or simply the company and they grow in different directions. For me, my transition from Manus was really about a personal life choices and wanting to be close to friends and family back on the West Coast, and just getting tired of shoveling snow in Cambridge. So After about 5 years at Manus, had really felt like I built the enzyme engineering team that I was brought on to support, and had you know put people in a position on that team to succeed even in my absence. And so left to come back here to Seattle and start yet another company.
So let's talk about Verbio because, as they say, you either succeed or you learn. But Verbio was definitely, a lot of learnings.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, it was an opportunity to work with David Baker, now a Nobel laureate, at a time when I think the enzyme, or excuse me, protein design techniques that he was using were really, I would argue, underappreciated. And I had seen this Nature publication that he had put out, he and a postdoc of his, and was really inspired to try and commercialize that technology back in 2016. And one can always, in hindsight, look back at, say, the composition of the team or the timing of the technology or the product market fit as potential weaknesses in the venture thesis. But for me, the power of that learning experience was as much about any individual feature in the venture as it was about challenging myself to query each operational mode that I could envision for that venture, and finding the sort of challenge of getting it going. Because when you succeed, you really only succeed in one mode. When you fail in many, many modes usually before you sort of decide to hang up the towel. And that was really powerful for me as a founder, and and also helped me navigate some of this transition of sort of personal growth for urgency and ownership. I think everyone is very passionate about their science and their technology and their venture thesis. But sometimes that passion can blind you to some of the fundamental features of what you're building. And so I think I came away from that experience a much more dispassionate entrepreneur than I was going in.
I hear you. So then, at what point does HDT Bio, come knocking as the next rodeo?
Yeah, as I think many would mirror, relationships from one situation come full circle in another. And it was actually an investor who had passed on Vervio, came back to me sometime later and said, "Hey, I really appreciated what you were building then, even though it wasn't right for us. But there's this new thing over here that I think you could be really influential in." And in doing so, introduced me to a couple of gentlemen who were developing RNA vaccine technology in 2019. And we developed the vision for HDT Bio around the idea of cancer vaccines using RNA, which was, we weren't alone in that thinking at the time. But RNA was not yet an accepted modality in the sort of therapeutic portfolio. And then all of a sudden in early 2020, the pandemic hits, and everyone is banging down our door for infectious disease vaccines. And that very quickly catalyzed the growth of HDT Bio through multiple government contracts and international licensing transactions and clinical trials. And ultimately, the demonstration that the underlying technology at hand there was tremendously successful in terms of differentiating itself in patient safety and memory and cellular immune response through clinical development in a number of different countries, but principally in India, where ultimately that technology received emergency use authorization.
So obviously, at this point, you had raised money, a couple of times, given your experience with previous companies as well. So how did you guys go about raising the 20 million there? I mean, what was the experience? What were you looking for really in investors?
Yeah, I think myself and the other founders had a good amount of previous fundraising experience and working with institutional capital. So in the case of HDT Bio, our investor base was largely angels from the outset, and supplemented quite heavily with a combination, as I was mentioning, of government grants and contracts and international licensing revenue. So you put all those things together, and all of a sudden you have this funding base that isn't tied discretely to mm, traditional venture capital fund cycles, or let's say market driven liquidity opportunities and things like that. And so it was fascinating for us as founders and operators to see the sort of, what was it, 2021, 2022 downturn in the public markets, and the consequences that had for any number of our peers in the sort of early stage biopharmaceutical world, and how relatively insulated we were given the diversity of capital base that we had built. And that basis has ultimately led to the company growing now to 50 plus people, I believe, and continuing to innovate on that RNA vaccine platform through partnerships with the government and other commercial entities to look at still more infectious disease applications, having recently published some of those successes, and some continued interest in the cancer vaccine regime as well.
So now, when it comes to timing, it sounds like you know when the time is right. And you did that with Manus Bio. You did that too now with HDT Bio to go at it again, with another company, which you just started, Decycle Bio. I mean, talk to us about timing, because also as a founder, it's just like saying goodbye to your baby. That's not easy.
Yeah, and it's that fit, and sometimes you maybe leave too early or you stay too long, and there's no science to it. I would say it's really about personal feel and the way a company evolves as people evolve. Yeah, and you learn things about yourself and where you are in your life. And one of the things that changed for me in my life during the HDT bio journey was, well, of course, the pandemic affected everyone, but I also got married and had two kids along the way. And so, in the course of that 5 year journey, I'd say my entire world changed kind of around me. Like the business, I was doing all the business things that I knew I was in for, but my personal life changed quite a bit. And one of the things that having kids, I think, made me realize was just how important every day is, and how important the future is for our children. And I would say that's one of the things that inspired Decycle Bio is, I had spent maybe 10 years almost working in the biopharmaceutical space after leaving Manus Bio, which was kind of a sustainability play. And 2024, I've had my second kid, and I read this paper from MIT on um, biochemical reaction modeling and using AI. And I got really excited because I had flashbacks to my time at Manus Bio and seeing this new technology as an opportunity to expand upon that work. Reached out to some of the authors and struck up a conversation. And as is often the case in entrepreneurship, one conversation leads to another, and things just start to snowball. So by middle of last year, I think we had pretty strong conviction that there was a new business to be built, developing this technology, and that is what has become Decycle Bio. So we just closed our first financing in January, and we now have four of us founders full time on this new vision.
So what is Decycle Bio? I mean, what's all about? Give us the 30-second, high level.
Yeah, so we're using these computational approaches originally developed at MIT and combining them with what are called cell-free systems and techniques that we're adopting from one of our faculty advisors at Stanford. And we bridge the gap between those two approaches using the types of enzyme engineering that I was practicing all the way back at Manus. And when we combine these approaches, it creates an opportunity to conduct what some people refer to as waste to value transformations. When we think about all of the great industries that society has built over generations, many of these global scale industries have waste streams that are otherwise contaminants to our environment. And these technologies like ours create the opportunity to modify waste streams into value added products. When we do that, we think about it at the molecular layer. And so we think about taking in waste molecules and using enzymes through an enzymatic cascade to convert those into chemical products of value. And because of the nature of those waste streams, these tend to be more sustainable processes than what are used mostly today to produce chemicals, which are oil and gas feedstocks and high temperature, high pressure, even toxic processes for manufacturing. So by and large, we're using biology to create more sustainable chemical manufacturing.
So obviously now, as a repeated founder, raising money is not as hard because people can see that you've been around the block. How do you go about filtering the right investors for the right reasons?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Though I wouldn't necessarily, it's always so much easier. Every venture is a little bit different. And, the phenotype of investor that we talk to at Decycle Bio is certainly different than the one we might talk to at HTT Bio. And the team is different, the technology is different, the marketplaces are different. So it's always a new story. But indeed, relationships survive these venture experiences, and so it is a little bit easier. But to your question about sort of investor phenotype, um, I tend to think about investors that are in it for the right reasons. So maybe not necessarily mission or impact driven investors per se, but investors who put the founders and the venture first uh, is something I think many would put lip service to, but practicing that is not so ubiquitous, I would say. And getting to know your investors before taking that check is really important for early stage founders. And whether that's just by talking with them directly or talking to the founders of other of their portfolio companies, and even just researching those portfolio companies to see, who have they shepherded as founders and ventures through that growth journey, especially if you're talking about pre-seed or seed stage investors. That track record for translation as an investor is, from my perspective, every bit important as the same navigating the same transition as an operator. It says something about the type of support that they can provide and about the relationships they may have at the next layer of investor. And so we try to be quite thoughtful about who we bring around the table. And I suppose the other feature is, have they operated within your technological or market regimes before as well? Because it will say something about their ability to help you curate human resources, capital resources, business resources throughout your development.
So, Christopher, imagine you go to sleep tonight and you wake up in a world where the vision, of the company is fully realized. What does that world look like?
Yeah, I think it's a world where hopefully Decycle Bio has been successful enough to bring multiple sustainable chemical products to market and have displaced, some unsustainable chemical manufacturing incumbent in doing so. And hopefully we've been, but a small part of that grander transition to improving the sustainability of the chemicals industry broadly.
So obviously we're talking about the future here, but I want to talk about the past with a lens of reflection. What if I was to put you into a time machine and I bring you back to the MIT days, to those days where you're now thinking about venturing into the unknown, thinking about co-founding, a company with your classmates. If you could go back to that moment in time and give that younger Christopher one piece of advice for launching a business, what would that be and why, given all the experience that you have now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at that time, there were a couple of learnings. We talked a little bit about my experience at Manus Bio and growing as a professional in the sort of managerial and entrepreneurial ways that I did, and then becoming more dispassionate at through my experience at Vervio. And I think if I could wrap all of that up in a sort of storytelling for myself coming out of my PhD work, I would have, you know, I think found my way just a little bit more easily. There is always growing pains, but hearing it from, sometimes you have to hear it from yourself to really hear it. And so, yeah, something along those lines probably would have made my life a little bit easier through those first couple of entrepreneurial experiences.
I love it. So, Christopher, for the people that are listening that would love to reach out and say hi, what is the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, certainly find me on LinkedIn, reach out through our info page at the landing for Decycle.bio, and, drop me a note. I'm always eager to help try and support early stage founders. I do so as broadly as I can locally here in Seattle. I do so in support of the MIT entrepreneurship ecosystem broadly. So, yeah, I can't encourage folks enough to go on this journey. I mean, I've had successes and failures along the way, and our country and the world need more entrepreneurial leaders to help lead us into the future.
Amazing. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for being on the Dealmaker Show today. It has been an absolute honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.